At exactly 1:47 in the morning, the security camera guarding the front door suddenly went dark. It was a deliberate disconnection. This single catastrophic misjudgment in the crucial early hours would set off a chain reaction of devastating errors. They were burning daylight, looking in all the wrong places. The officers meant well, but their preconceived notions about elderly individuals completely blinded them to the reality of a targeted attack. The attacker had a massive head start. They had hours to escape. They had hours to hide their tracks. And the very people sworn to catch them were busy treating a crime scene like a public park. The frustration mounting within the family was suffocating. They knew Nancy would never walk away. They knew she could not survive long without her pills. As the sun began to set on the first day of her disappearance, the horrifying truth became impossible to ignore. She was not lost. She was taken. And the crucial evidence needed to prove it was being trampled into the dirt right outside her front door. The disparity between what the family knew in their bones and what the police were officially documenting created a terrifying chasm. Every hour that ticked by without a forensic team securing the perimeter was an hour stolen from the pursuit of justice. Evidence would be trampled. Critical leads would vanish into the desert air. The blood on the porch was eventually confirmed by forensic DNA testing to belong to Nancy herself. It was undeniable proof of injury. Yet the initial momentum of the investigation had already been pushed in the wrong direction. The damage to the crime scene was already done. The golden hour had passed. The mishandling of the initial response was not just a simple oversight. It was a symptom of a much larger and more deeply rooted problem within the department. As the days dragged on, the sheer magnitude of the investigative failures began to surface. It is alleged that Pima County Sheriff Chris Nanos assigned a homicide detective with absolutely no prior experience in murder investigations to lead this incredibly complex case. This decision proved to be catastrophic. The crime scene was released entirely too early. Once the authorities finally realized that they were dealing with a violent abduction and not a wandering senior, they had to scramble to lock the property back down. And a brazen kidnapping would spiral into one of the most agonizing unsolved mysteries in recent history. They established a perimeter and sealed the house only to release it again and then cordon it off multiple times in the following days. This chaotic back and forth utterly destroyed any remaining shred of forensic integrity. If the attacker had dropped a hair or left a partial footprint, it was completely lost in the shuffle of officers walking in and out of the house. The defense attorneys for any future suspect would have an absolute field day tearing apart the chain of custody. The authorities had essentially handed a gift to the kidnapper. Just as the realization of this colossal failure began to sink in the case, took another bizarre and terrifying turn. Electronic ransom notes suddenly appeared in the email inboxes of the family members. The messages were cold and demanding. The sender claimed to have Nancy and demanded a massive payout in Bitcoin in exchange for her safe return. The sudden introduction of a digital ransom demand threw the already disorganized investigation into complete chaos. The family was desperate. The evidence and legal documents surrounding this investigation are still evolving every single day. So if you want to, they immediately offered a massive reward reaching $1 million for any information leading to her safe return. But the kidnappers remained hidden behind encrypted networks. The police were now fighting a war on two fronts. They were trying to salvage a ruined physical crime scene while simultaneously tracking a digital ghost demanding cryptocurrency. The sheer amateurish execution of the initial crime scene containment by the responding officers felt like a betrayal. The community relies on law enforcement to protect them, to secure the evidence, and to hunt down the predators, but in this case, the predators were seemingly being aided by the very system designed to stop them. The officers who let the scene get contaminated were not acting maliciously, but their incompetence was just as destructive. The alleged assignment of an inexperienced detective to a high-profile abduction case raised serious questions about leadership and protocol. If you want to dive deeper into how systemic failures in local police departments allow violent criminals to slip, uncover the hidden truths buried beneath official police reports, hit subscribe and join us here at the Ellis Evidence Room. Through the cracks, make sure to subscribe to the Ellis Evidence Room so we can keep analyzing these critical missteps. The ransom notes demanding Bitcoin added a modern layer of terror to a very physical crime. It proved that the attacker was sophisticated enough to use anonymous routing and cryptocurrency wallets. This was not a random burglary gone wrong. This was a calculated strike. The kidnapper watched the house. They bypassed the camera. They snatched a vulnerable woman, and now they were demanding money while sitting safely behind a computer screen. The police had completely lost control of the narrative, and the suspect was pulling all the strings from the shadows. The sheer audacity of sending electronic ransom demands while the police were actively fumbling the physical evidence highlighted a massive disparity in competence. The attacker was operating on a completely different level of preparation. We are stepping past the yellow tape to examine exactly what happened. They understood the vulnerabilities of the security hardware, and they clearly understood how to mask their digital footprint. Every single demand for Bitcoin was a taunt. It was a reminder that while the detectives were busy sealing and unsealing a contaminated porch, the real perpetrator was miles away, watching the chaos unfold. The family was trapped in an agonizing limbo. They had the financial means to pay the ransom. They had the $1 million reward ready to be deployed. But they had no one to negotiate with and no guarantee that paying the digital currency would actually bring Nancy home. The encrypted emails offered no comfort. They only offered empty promises wrapped in extortion. The investigation was bleeding momentum from every possible angle. The physical clues were ruined, and the digital clues were completely obscured. The narrative the authorities initially pushed completely contradicts the physical reality left on that porch. The case was rapidly transforming from a rescue mission into an impossible puzzle. The local authorities were completely overwhelmed by the technological sophistication of the ransom demands and the rapidly deteriorating physical case. It became abundantly clear that they needed heavy reinforcements. The Federal Bureau of Investigation officially stepped in to assist with the digital forensics and the widening manhunt. The FBI brought resources that the local department simply did not possess. Their first major breakthrough did not come from the crime scene itself, but from the very security system that the attacker thought they had permanently disabled. When the masked figure disconnected the doorbell camera at 1:47 in the morning, they assumed that the video feed was gone forever, but they underestimated cloud storage architecture. FBI digital forensic experts managed to access the Google server backend that hosted the camera data. They meticulously recovered the corrupted files and pulled a stunning piece of evidence from the digital ether. They retrieved a clear video of the suspect from the exact moment the motion detection software flared back to life at 2:12 in the morning. To understand how a targeted abduction was brushed off as a medical episode, the footage revealed a male figure standing approximately 5 feet 9 inches tall. His face was completely obscured by a mask, but the camera captured several highly specific details. The man was wearing a visible handgun holster strapped to his side. More importantly, he was carrying a very distinct black 25-liter Ozark Trail backpack. This was a massive turning point. The digital ghost suddenly had a physical description. The backpack and the holster were tangible items that could be tracked, purchased, and identified. However, the progress on the physical front was immediately countered by a wall of frustration on the digital front. The cyber division of the FBI worked tirelessly to trace the internet protocol addresses attached to the incoming ransom emails. They mapped the digital pathways, trying to find the physical location of the computer sending the demands. But the sender was utilizing highly advanced anonymizing technology. We have to go back to the hours right before the camera feed was severed. The signals bounced across multiple encrypted servers, masking the true origin point completely. The digital trace hit a dead end. The ransom notes were untraceable. The focus had to shift entirely back to the physical clues recovered from the cloud server. The FBI began analyzing retail data, attempting to track recent purchases of the specific black Ozark Trail backpack within the surrounding counties. They cross-referenced height descriptions with known offenders. They pored over traffic camera footage, looking for any vehicles moving through the neighborhood between the hours of 1:47 and 2:12 in the morning. The investigation became a grueling exercise in data mining and pattern recognition. The authorities were desperately searching for a needle in a massive digital haystack. But the video from the Google backend provided a glimmer of hope. It proved that the attacker was not a phantom. The victim was not someone who took risks. They were a flesh and blood human being who bought gear, who drove a car, and who made mistakes. The discovery of the video completely validated the family and their initial fears. It definitively proved that Nancy did not wander away. She was confronted by an armed individual who came prepared to take her by force. The holster indicated a readiness for extreme violence. The mask indicated premeditation, and the specific backpack suggested a need to carry items away from the scene or bring specialized tools to bypass the locks. The narrative of the wandering senior was finally and permanently destroyed by undeniable photographic evidence. The investigation was now a full-blown manhunt for an armed and dangerous kidnapper. The authorities began to follow a new physical trail that led away from the house and out into the wider county. They started analyzing cell phone tower pings and license plate readers along major highways. Every single piece of data was scrutinized. 25 minutes later, at 2:12 in the morning, the motion detection software briefly flared back to life, capturing a chilling sight. She was not someone who would ever just leave her front door open and walk away into the cold night. The sheer volume of information was staggering, but the investigators were looking for one specific anomaly. They were looking for a digital breadcrumb that connected the masked figure on the porch to a real-world identity. The frustration of the untraceable Bitcoin demands was slowly being replaced by the steady, methodical tracking of physical evidence. The backpack was a glaring error by the suspect. It was a mass-produced item, but its specific combination with the holster and the mask created a unique profile. The authorities fed this profile into their databases, and suddenly the digital systems flagged a potential match. A geographical clue emerged, pulling the attention of the massive task force away from the immediate neighborhood and pointing them toward a completely different location. The investigation was suddenly hurtling toward the town of Rio Rico. 10 days had passed since the initial disappearance, and the atmosphere within the command center was growing increasingly desperate. Every aspect of her routine was meticulously planned out of sheer necessity. The calendar had flipped to February 10th, and the harsh reality of the medical timeline was bearing down on everyone involved. Without the essential prescriptions, the human body begins to shut down. The task force needed a tangible victory, and the geographical clue pointing south seemed to be the breakthrough they were praying for. A massive tactical operation was quietly assembled. Elite federal agents and regional tactical teams descended upon a specific address in the community of Rio Rico. This was not a standard knock-and-talk inquiry. This was a full-scale raid designed to breach a fortified position and neutralize a heavily armed suspect. They had a target in their sights. The individual residing at the property was a local delivery driver whose physical profile seemingly matched the parameters generated by the suspect matrix. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as the tactical units stacked up outside the residence. They were operating under the terrifying assumption that a hostage situation could erupt the moment they breached the perimeter. Every agent present knew the stakes. They were hoping to find a terrified captive locked in a back room. The police narrative was completely wrong from the very first minute, but the tragic consequences of that mistake would soon become terribly permanent. They were prepared for a firefight. The order was given, and the authorities swarmed the property with overwhelming force. The suspect was apprehended swiftly, and the premises were immediately secured. For a fleeting moment, a collective sigh of relief rippled through the higher echelons of the investigative team. They thought they had finally captured the phantom who orchestrated the entire nightmare. They thought the agonizing wait was over. But as the dust settled and the initial adrenaline rush faded, a crushing new reality began to take shape. Investigators tore through the house, searching for any sign of a concealed prisoner. They looked for medical supplies. They looked for any physical tie to the abducted woman. The search yielded absolutely nothing. The frantic energy of the raid slowly morphed into a chilling realization. As detectives sat down in the interrogation room with the apprehended delivery driver, the narrative completely unraveled. The timeline did not fit. The alibi was solid. She relied on a strict daily regimen just to survive. The physical evidence linking this specific individual to the crime scene simply did not exist. The authorities were forced to confront a devastating truth. They had the wrong man. It was a catastrophic case of mistaken identity. The driver was completely innocent and had absolutely zero connection to the horrific events that unfolded earlier that month. The suspect was released back into the community, and the task force was forced to watch their most promising lead disintegrate into thin air. The emotional whiplash experienced by the family was unimaginable. They were handed a beacon of hope only to have it violently extinguished mere hours later. The investigation was not just back to square one, it was actively sliding backward. The massive deployment of resources, the tactical raid, the public spectacle, it had all been a monumental waste of precious time. The real perpetrator was still out there, completely unbothered by the dramatic raid in Rio Rico. The authorities failed to see the danger right in front of them. The failure of the apprehension operation cast a long, dark shadow over the entire investigative process. The authorities had chased a ghost, while the true mastermind remained safely hidden. This high-profile blunder only amplified the growing public scrutiny. Questions began to swirl about the competence of the task force and the reliability of their intelligence gathering. If they could so spectacularly botch a major raid, what else were they getting wrong? The pressure cooker environment was creating cracks in the foundation of the case. The investigators were exhausted, the family was broken, and the public was losing faith. The desperate need for a suspect had clearly clouded the judgment of the tactical planners. They saw what they wanted to see instead of what the evidence actually supported. This tunnel vision is a common symptom in high-stress investigations, but in this particular scenario, it cost them dearly. 84-year-old Nancy Guthrie carried a pacemaker in her chest. While the tactical teams were busy tearing apart the wrong house, the actual kidnapper was using that time to further insulate themselves from capture. The botched raid was a stark reminder that the authorities were constantly playing catch-up. They were reacting to breadcrumbs rather than controlling the board. The true scale of the deception was about to be revealed, and it would completely redefine everything the investigators thought they knew about the motive. If you want to understand how a major federal operation can completely miss the mark, keep watching, because the most disturbing element of this case is about to surface. The focus now had to shift back to the only communication they had ever received. The digital trail was dead, but the psychological profile behind those messages was about to crack wide open, exposing a truly terrifying reality. The cyber extortion angle had completely dominated the strategic response for days. The authorities were pouring immense manpower into tracking cryptocurrency wallets and decrypting anonymous networks. Her daily survival depended on a highly structured routine and a precise schedule of necessary medication. But as the dust settled from the disastrous tactical failure down south, behavioral analysts began to look at the digital demands through a completely different lens. They stopped looking at the coding and started looking at the psychology of the negotiation. A glaring, terrifying paradox emerged from the text of those messages. The sender was aggressively demanding a massive fortune in digital currency. The family had countered by publicly offering a staggering $1 million cash reward. Money was clearly on the table, ready to be transferred. But the supposed captors flatly refused to complete the most basic, fundamental requirement of any hostage negotiation. They provided absolutely zero proof of life. In the dark world of ransom and abduction, proof of life is the absolute currency of trust. It is a current photograph holding a daily newspaper. It is a brief audio recording answering a specific, intimate question that only the captive would know. She was a vulnerable adult who required constant vigilance to maintain her health. It is the undeniable evidence that the product being purchased, the life of the hostage, still exists. Despite the astronomical sums being discussed, the anonymous senders would not offer a single shred of evidence that they actually had a living, breathing person in their custody. This was a massive structural anomaly. A financially motivated crew would eagerly provide a picture to secure $1 million payout. The absolute silence on this front forced the analysts to construct a chilling new hypothesis. What if the primary motive was never financial? What if the digital demands were nothing more than a brilliantly executed misdirection? The investigators realized they were looking at a textbook red herring. A red herring is a deliberately planted clue designed to lead pursuers down a false trail. The extortion emails were deployed to create a massive, chaotic distraction, and it worked flawlessly. Her family knew this better than anyone else. By injecting the specter of a sophisticated cybercrime into the narrative, the perpetrator forced the authorities to split their focus and their resources. The local department was already drowning in the consequences of their ruined physical scene management. The sudden appearance of cryptocurrency demands pushed them completely over the edge. The digital decoy exploited the exact weaknesses of the investigative framework. While detectives were chasing phantom internet protocols, the physical trail of the actual suspect grew colder by the minute. The realization that the emails were a hoax designed to waste time fundamentally altered the entire scope of the tragedy. This was not a kidnapping for profit. This was an abduction with a far more sinister and likely personal objective. The phantom cyber criminals never intended to negotiate because they likely never intended to return anyone alive. The money was a smokescreen. The real horror lay in the fact that the actual physical perpetrator, the person who stood on that porch with a weapon, was operating under a completely different agenda. On the evening of January 31st, Nancy attended a quiet family dinner at the home of her daughter, Annie. The task force had essentially spent over a week negotiating with a mirage. They were fighting shadows while the true monster walked away clean. The brilliance of the red herring was its perfect timing. It hit the command center just as panic over the contaminated environment was reaching its peak. It provided a convenient, high-tech villain to focus on drawing attention away from the glaring physical errors happening on the ground. The sender knew exactly how law enforcement would react to a cyber threat. They knew it would trigger federal involvement and bog down the system in jurisdictional red tape and technical analysis. This level of psychological manipulation requires a deep understanding of police procedure and crisis management. It suggests an adversary who is not just violent, but highly calculating and incredibly patient. The revelation of the decoy strategy sent shockwaves through the investigative ranks. They had been thoroughly outmaneuvered. A figure stood on the porch wearing a mask. It was a completely normal evening filled with conversation and warmth. The devastating truth was that the absence of a verified living status was not a negotiation tactic. It was a silent admission of the bleakest possible outcome. The digital extortionists could not produce a photograph because there was no one left to photograph. The entire cryptocurrency angle was a phantom limb designed to twitch and distract while the main body of the crime was successfully hidden away forever. If you are shocked by the sheer manipulative power of this strategy, make sure to hit that subscribe button, because the Ellis Evidence Room is dedicated to breaking down these complex criminal maneuvers. The decoy had successfully run out the clock, the medical window had long since closed, and the authorities were left staring at a blank wall with no physical suspects and no digital trail. The realization that they had been chasing a carefully constructed illusion brought the investigation to a grinding, agonizing halt. The momentum was completely shattered. The tactical blunders and the digital wild goose chase had consumed the most critical window of opportunity. As the night wound down, her son-in-law, Tommaso Cioni, offered to drive her back to her own house. The community was left grappling with a profound sense of vulnerability. A citizen had been taken from her own doorstep, and the massive apparatus of the state had failed to bring her home. The fallout from these cascading failures was swift and extremely bitter. The public demanded accountability for the sheer volume of procedural errors that plagued the early days of the search. The outrage was not just directed at the phantom kidnapper, but at the very leadership that allowed the crime scene to be compromised. The frustration culminated in a severe internal crisis within the local department. It is alleged that the top law enforcement official, Sheriff Chris Nanos, is now facing a formal no confidence vote. This extraordinary measure reflects the deep-seated anger and the complete erosion trust among the rank-and-file officers and the citizens they are sworn to protect. The alleged assignment of an unqualified investigator to such a sensitive and complex operation is viewed as a fatal dereliction of duty. He knew the protocols. He knew that you do not just drop Nancy off at the curb and drive away. The controversy surrounding the departmental leadership has transformed the tragedy into a bitter political battleground. But while the bureaucratic infighting consumes the headlines, the most important figure in this entire nightmare remains entirely absent. The victim has never been located. Despite the massive rewards, the federal assistance, and the endless hours of grid searches, the desert has refused to yield its secrets. The family is trapped in a permanent state of ambiguous loss. They cannot grieve because they do not have definitive answers. They cannot find closure because there is no physical resolution. They are left with an empty house, a broken security system, and a terrifying void where a loved one used to be. The justice system requires evidence to function. It needs physical ties, it needs digital footprints, and it needs suspects in custody. This case currently possesses none of those essential elements. The perpetrator executed a nearly flawless extraction utilizing misdirection and exploiting the inherent biases of the first responders. When they arrived at her residence, Tommaso pulled into the driveway and waited. They weaponized the assumption of elderly confusion to buy themselves the ultimate commodity, which is time. And they used that time to vanish completely off the face of the earth. The community is haunted by the reality that a highly organized predator is still operating out there somewhere. The lack of an arrest means there is no deterrent. The methods used in this abduction were successful. The contamination of the area, the deployment of the digital decoy, all of it worked exactly as intended. The chilling implication is that this level of sophistication could easily be deployed again. The agonizing lack of resolution leaves a dark stain on the history of the county. A life was stolen and the machinery of justice completely stalled out. The leadership is under fire. The investigative trails are freezing cold, and the family is left waiting for a phone call that may never come. He watched closely as Nancy stepped out of the vehicle and walked toward the entrance. The silence that surrounds this case is deafening. It is a constant reminder of the fragility of safety and the devastating consequences of systemic incompetence. The absence of accountability leaves an open wound in the community. Residents now look at their own locked doors and security systems with deep suspicion, wondering if any of it actually matters against a determined threat. The institutional failure demonstrated here serves as a grim warning to every surrounding district. When protocols are ignored, when assumptions replace rigorous forensic procedure, the advantage is immediately handed to the criminal. The burden of this failure rests heavily on the shoulders of the investigators, who must live with the knowledge that their early actions directly contributed to the current stalemate. The endless waiting is a psychological torture for the relatives who must navigate every holiday and every milestone with a massive unresolved trauma hanging over their heads. The ultimate tragedy is that the system designed to find her was broken from the very start. He kept his eyes on her until she was safely inside the building. What this case teaches us about the vulnerability of the golden hour is truly profound. When we analyze the timeline forensically, we see exactly how cognitive bias can completely dismantle a criminal pursuit. The initial responders allowed their preconceived notions about age and cognitive ability to override the physical evidence presented to them. The presence of bodily fluids at an entry point should automatically trigger a violent crime protocol. By downgrading the threat level to a missing person search based purely on demographics, the department willingly surrendered the most critical period of any major investigation. This systemic failure highlights a terrifying reality regarding community safety. The legal framework is incredibly fragile, and it can be shattered simply by the subjective assumptions of the first person wearing a badge to arrive. Furthermore, this investigation provides a masterclass in modern digital manipulation. The introduction of anonymous electronic demands serves as a stark warning about the evolution of criminal strategy. In the modern era, we must learn to identify the markers of a digital decoy. He waited until he heard the hum of the garage door mechanism. A legitimate, financially motivated operation will absolutely prioritize establishing trust through a verified proof of life. The complete absence of verifiable proof in any extortion scenario should immediately be flagged, not as a negotiation, but as an active attempt at narrative control. It is a deliberate tactic to overwhelm resources and force law enforcement to chase shadows. Understanding the psychological mechanics behind a red herring is absolutely crucial for modern crime analysis. It forces us to question every piece of data and look past the obvious distractions to find the true underlying motive hiding beneath the surface. We must critically evaluate whether the evidence is genuine or simply a carefully constructed illusion designed to manipulate our perception of the truth. The unresolved nature of this abduction leaves us with an incredibly haunting final thought to consider. The intruder thought they had completely blinded the property when they cut the feed at 1:47 in the morning. They operated with total confidence, believing their identity was protected by the darkness. If the internal storage drive had been physically destroyed instead of merely disconnected, would the authorities have ever known what actually transpired on that porch? At exactly 9:50 in the evening, the heavy garage door lowered and clicked completely shut. The chilling reality is that the entire narrative hinges on a few corrupted seconds of recovered data. It makes you wonder how many other perfect crimes are successfully executed because the digital footprint was effectively erased. The masked figure walked away into the night, carrying a backpack full of secrets and leaving behind a shattered family. The questions remain unanswered, and the true identity of the mastermind is still buried in the desert. We will continue to pull the thread on this investigation as new documents are unsealed. If you want to follow the evidence with us and dive into the next digital dossier, make sure to subscribe to the Ellis Evidence Room. We will see you in the next case file. Only then did Tommaso put his car in gear and drive away. He left knowing she was secure behind locked doors. By the time the sun rose over the quiet neighborhood, the intruder was gone, but they had left something behind. This was a woman who meticulously secured her home. The idea that she would suddenly become disoriented, unlock her own deadbolts, and wander aimlessly into the freezing night was entirely contrary to her established behavior. Her reliance on her daily medication meant that every passing hour without it was a direct threat to her life. There was a silent ticking clock attached to her very existence. When that garage door closed at 9:50, the house should have been a fortress. Nancy should have been preparing for bed, surrounded by the safety of her familiar walls. Her family went to sleep that night with complete peace of mind. But the fortress had a fatal flaw. The security system that was supposed to act as a digital shield was quietly failing. The peace of mind her family felt was an illusion. The timeline of her safe return was officially logged, but the timeline of her disappearance was already being written by someone waiting in the shadows. There was unmistakable blood smeared across the front porch. The locked doors were not enough to keep the danger out. The neighborhood was quiet and the streets were empty. No one heard any glass break. No one heard any screams for help. The transition from a peaceful evening to a nightmare happened without a single neighbor raising an alarm. 9:50 in the evening marked the final confirmed moment she was known to be safe. The strict medical requirement she lived with meant that an unplanned departure was a physical impossibility. She could not skip her doses. She could not afford to be separated from her pill organizers or the emergency protocols established by her doctors. Every single detail of her life before that night was built around preservation and caution. The careful observation by her son-in-law proves she was not displaying any signs of cognitive decline or erratic behavior during the car ride home. She was alert and she was safe. The sheer normality of the evening makes the events that followed even more disturbing. The signs of a violent struggle were carved into the very entrance of the home. The closed garage door should have been the end of the story for that day. It should have been the final mundane act of a typical Wednesday night. Instead, it was the prologue to a meticulously planned invasion. The silence that wrapped around her home was not a blanket of safety. It was the cover for an intruder who had already targeted the property. The ticking clock of her pacemaker beat steadily in her chest, completely unaware that her sanctuary was about to be breached. When Sunday morning arrived, the quiet unease hovering over the house shattered completely. Nancy was a devout woman who maintained a strict Sunday routine. She always logged into her church congregation online service without fail. But on the morning of February 1st, her digital presence was conspicuously missing. Yet when the first responding officers arrived on the scene, they took one look at the blood and made a baffling assumption. She did not sign in. The family immediately sensed that something was terribly wrong. They tried calling her phone, but the calls went entirely unanswered. Panic began to set in quickly. Relatives rushed over to her property to check on her well-being. When they arrived, they found the house terrifyingly empty. Nancy was nowhere to be found. But the front porch told a different and deeply sinister story. There were distinct smears of blood staining the concrete near the entrance. The sight of the blood immediately elevated the situation from a worrying absence to a potential tragedy. The family wasted no time and immediately dialed 911 to report her missing. They stressed her advanced age, they stressed her pacemaker, and her absolute need for daily medication. When the first responding police officers pulled up to the residence, the family expected a swift and aggressive criminal investigation to launch immediately. According to initial reports, they decided that the homeowner, an elderly woman, had simply wandered off in a state of confusion. They expected the property to be sealed off with crime scene tape. They expected forensic units to begin swabbing the blood and dusting for fingerprints. Instead, they witnessed a response that defied all logic. According to several reports, the officers on the scene took a cursory look around and decided that Nancy had likely suffered a medical episode and wandered off on her own. They framed the situation as a search and rescue operation for a disoriented senior citizen. The visible blood on the porch was seemingly minimized or ignored in those critical early hours. The deliberate disconnection of the security cameras was not immediately treated as a massive red flag indicating foul play. While the family was paralyzed with fear over a violent abduction, the authorities began printing missing person flyers. They organized search parties to comb the nearby desert scrub and neighborhoods. How does a potential crime scene with visible blood and compromised security cameras instantly get classified as a routine search for a lost senior citizen? They were looking for a lost woman who was probably confused and hiding under a bush. This fundamental misreading of the evidence meant that the property was not treated as a protected crime scene. Relatives and friends and law enforcement personnel walked freely around the house. They stepped on the porch. They moved through the hallways. Every single footstep risked destroying whatever microscopic evidence the attacker had left behind. The golden hour of the investigation, that precious window of time where physical evidence is pristine and trails are fresh, was rapidly evaporating. The blood on the ground was a loud, flashing warning sign that violence had occurred, but the official narrative stubbornly clung to the idea of a medical emergency. The family was left to frantically search the streets, hoping to find her wandering, while the real explanation lay in the corrupted data of the security system and the bloodstains at their feet.